You're listening to the Be So Good podcast with Colin Pierce. Colin says you are 10 times better than you think. So why not be so good that they simply can't ignore you? Here's your host, Colin Pierce.
You're about to meet one of my best friends and a very fascinating man. He began his career as a young fellow with BP Australia in Perth, a young cadet. And then he moved to Brisbane with BP. And not long after that, he got the call, as we used to say. He became a Church of Christ minister. In fact, he studied for many, many years and got his brain in gear. And then he began an illustrious career as a minister of churches, which he grew phenomenally just by nature of his strong and courageous, insightful leadership. I think all of that got him involved in the Dale Carnegie Institute because for 25 years, he was a Dale Carnegie lecturer, becoming an expert in all forms of communication, memory work, and stress management. Today, Graham's retired. Well, that's what he says, but people keep asking him to be interim pastors of their churches. And so for the last 6 or 7 years, that's what he's done. He goes and steps in and rescues somebody and does a great job of it. And he does it without any stress. So please, will you welcome my very good friend, Graham Agnew.
Hi, Cole. Good to be with you.
And you too. Graham, you've been very busy over the years. How do you stop yourself getting stressed?
Well, I guess in various ways, Cole, I have a belief, and it's been a growing belief over many years, that stress is it's not like being on a runaway train, where you're hurtling down a mountain and it's going to end in disaster and you've got no control. In actual fact, we do have a lot of control in the way we manage stress. We can actually make decisions. We can choose to follow certain principles. And over the years, I guess I've just acquired a whole list of principles and techniques that I've personally applied to try to not eradicate, but at least manage the level of stress which comes to all of us inevitably. Stress is a reality of life, and a lot of stress is positive.
Well, let's talk about stress. In terms of today, do you find it's how serious is stress as a problem in 2021?
Well, the so-called experts, like people like the Psychological Association of Australia, their surveys tell us that 35% of Australians have what they call as significant levels of stress in their lives. So that's 1 in 3. Now, as I said a moment ago, a lot of stress is positive. We're at our best when we feel the pressure to excel. Yourself from your speaking career, the nerves you get before a speaking engagement, that's stressful, but it's a positive because it brings out your best. But if we've got 1 in 3 people who are saying, look, we are really feeling the burden of living, and we're constantly in a state of wondering, what the future holds, that's a pretty serious problem, Colin. Of course, it's been accelerated and accentuated by this COVID pandemic that we're in. That's introduced a whole new range of things for people to worry about.
How is stress manifesting itself with people? How do people find themselves stuck with it?
I think it varies from person to person, Cole, but the obvious ones are, it can affect health, sleeplessness, irritability, which affects relationships. Of course, at the wider social level, a lot of people cope with stress through involvement with drugs or gambling, and so that introduces a whole lot of social problems that the government and other agencies have got to try and manage. But just in a sort of regular kind of person, I think it's mainly in the area of how they handle relationships and just their general health. I know medical people who tell me that they put it as high as 70% of all illnesses can be attributed to worry and stress in one form or another. And that's a pretty frightening statistic. I must say, over the years, dealing with people pastorally, now this is sort of, I've got no empirical evidence for this, it's just anecdotal evidence, but people who are really, really stressful and really, really anxious all the time, in my experience, often they are people who have a corresponding number of health issues. It doesn't follow, like, as I say, it's just been an observation. I've come to the realization, this is one thing I have found. People handle their crises pretty much like they handle their life when things are going okay. So if you're a fairly relaxed, let's see what happens, we'll get through this kind of person in normal circumstances, when the news comes that you've got a terminal illness or there's been a tragedy, you'll probably eventually handle that crisis in the same way that you've handled your life in general.
You are speaking, of course, from the experience of meeting the lovely Christine and living with the gorgeous Beverly. These are two
Yes.
of the least stressful individuals I've ever met. And if they don't live to 110 each, I'll be astounded. But I won't be there, neither will you.
Well, they are very serene. We're very blessed with very what I call serene wives, Cole, who keep us in check.
Well, that gives me a clue that it's sort of a genetic gift to not be the kind that gets themselves worked up. Would that be fair? I mean, mind you, I do get a bit of cold shoulder and hot tongue now and again, but it is now and again. So, do you think temperament has a bit to do with it?
Oh, I'm sure of that. Yeah, absolutely. There are people who are more inclined to panic and stress than others based on temperament, as you say. But I think right across the board, there are decisions that anybody can make, irrespective of temperament. Once you know what the techniques are, and of course, like anything, you've got to really apply yourself. Like, I'll give you an example. It's very simple, and most people would know this, but I refuse to worry about anything that I cannot directly influence. Now, I'll give you an example. We raised 2 teenage kids, and Saturday nights, most important thing for a pastor is to get a good night's sleep. And we went through the period with the kids when they were teenagers, where they go off to the city. And Bev, who is normally very composed, but when it comes to the kids, she can be a little bit anxious. And she used to say, "Oh gosh, I wonder what's happening," or would hear something on the television. There'd been a skirmish in Pioneer Street or something. And I would say quite deliberately, "Look, darling, in today's society, those kids are carrying ID. If something happens, we will get a phone call or we'll get a knock at the door. That's when we'll start to stress. Until then, there is absolutely no way in the world we can influence the situation." These were before the tracker, the trackers you can get on phones. We didn't know exactly where the kids were. So what else can you do? So you can actually train yourself. And the same with travel. I mean, how many of us have been at an airport and the comes over the PA, "Sorry, that flight's been delayed by 2 hours," or whatever. What are you going to do? You're going to go up and pound the desk. "Sorry, I need to get to Sydney. I must get on that next." Like, you cannot control that. You cannot influence it. And I've been in those situations. And so what do? You just think, okay, now how can I maximise this next couple of hours by doing things that'll save me doing them in a 2-hour time slot at another time? You just sort of go, and it takes, I guess, it takes intentionality. And you've got to be quite deliberate in your choice, but it is a choice you can make.
People get mini stressed or mini sessions of stress, say, for example, fear of flying or a flying experience which stresses them momentarily. When they get back on the ground, their normal unstressed self. I remember flying from Christchurch to Adelaide across the New Zealand Alps, the Southern Alps, isn't that what they're called anyway?
Yes.
The plane was bouncing around something horrible, mate. I could see at the window, the wings are going up and down at a great rate. And I hung on to my seat. I have no idea why. Because if I went, it went regardless. After about 15 minutes of this pretty nerve-wracking stuff where I could feel myself perspiring, I was heated up, the pilot said, "Yeah, sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. We often get a bit of turbulence across the Alps there. And you probably saw the wings flapping up and down. They had another 2 or 3 feet to go because these wings are designed to resist that kind of pressure." And I thought to myself, you might have told us that before we got to the place. But that was over. I didn't remain stressed about it. So there's short-term stress and there's long-term stress, isn't there? What's the difference? Is somebody actually talk themselves into staying stressed and wired about everything?
Well, I think in your case, that example you've just given, Cole, that highlights another principle with stress, and that is knowledge and awareness. We become stressed and fearful about the things we don't understand. Now, when you mentioned about flying, I have to tell you, I went through a period of my life, particularly was when we had kids. And I guess I started to think of my own mortality and what that would mean for the kids if ever it happened, if ever my premature death took place. And I was an absolute white knuckle flyer, was for years. And it was at a time, unfortunately, when I was doing a lot of flying. And I found out about people who would be dropped off at the airport by their colleagues or by their, somebody in the company, and they would then go make their own way to a train. This is between Adelaide and Melbourne, and they'd actually catch a train across. I heard about extreme cases like that. So I was a very nervous flyer. But then into my life came a most wonderful guy who was a senior captain with Ansett Airlines, as it was then, here in Adelaide. And he heard of my problem, and he arranged for me to sit up in the cockpit with him on a flight between Adelaide, Ceduna, Port Lincoln, and then back to Adelaide. So I sat in the so-called dicky seat up there, and I came to the realisation these guys want to get down back to earth as much as I do. And I saw exactly what's involved in flying a plane. And he answered every one of my questions. I was the sort of guy, I'd be sitting on the tarmac, and I'd hear this bump, bump, bumping, and I'd think, do the air hostesses, can they hear that? What's that? Is something loose? Is something falling off? They're just throwing the bags into the cargo hold, So it's sort of, knowledge is one way, or increasing one's knowledge and overcoming is a way of overcoming fears and reducing stress, as you've just proved. But I think some stress is very is long term, like a fear of flying, that can just go on and on and on. Other stress is short term, like for years I would circulate the block around a house I was meant to visit to see if they had a dog. And this was before mobile phones. And of course, even up until recent years, I would phone a home and say, look, I noticed you've got a dog up the side there. I'm out the front. Is he okay? Now, that's me. I had a bad experience with a dog when I was a little boy. My mother got attacked by Alsatians, and I was in the pram, and so it's somewhere there in my subconscious. And but so that's, people, you've got to, stress can manifest itself from a bad experience for most of a person's life, unless you take steps to overcome it.
There's a lot of, we could go and talk about all the causes of stress and where it comes from, what it does to us. Would you say it's important for a leader to manage their stress? I'm thinking, because I reckon they would manifest in anger and irritability and uncontrollable behaviour, and that'll upset the team, I guess. Did I just answer that question myself?
Yeah. Well, Colin, I think a leader has got to be able to manage stress, because you've got to be aware of your environment, whether it's sales or whatever the business you're in. You've got to have a certain stability, a certain level of composure to understand what your market is. You've got to you certainly, as a leader, have to invest in your staff, and they don't want somebody who's constantly in a state of panic or, as you say, irritability and so on. And I think there's a lot of modelling involved in being a leader as well. I love the old saying, calm people. And I've had experiences in my ministry when we passed through various crises as a ministry team, and I've always sought to give strong leadership in the sense of remaining as together as I can, and in that way inspiring the team to hang on tightly, believing we will get through this. You can, again, another great principle that I've used, Colin, over the years is answering three questions. What is the worst that can happen? And then, how can I prepare for the worst? And if you only go that far, that's going to increase your stress. The third question is, how can I improve on the worst? So what is the worst? How can I prepare? How can I improve on the worst? And I lived in Sydney for many years, and the guy who lived across from me was a very successful business guy, and I saw him up in the shops one day up at Macquarie Shopping Centre, and he was very distressed. In fact, the first time I'd ever seen him really distressed. He was usually a very together guy. He was with his wife, and they both had tears in their eyes. Turns out he'd just been told he had stage 4 prostate cancer. And so my wife and I, we paused, had a chat with him, and sort of try to offer support. And I asked the question. I said, "Hey, Bob, how long have you known about this?" And it all came out. He'd had the symptoms for over 12 months. He said, "Haven't you seen my light on in the study?" He said, "I'm up all night Googling and trying to figure out what's going on." I said, "Did you go to a doctor?" He said, "I didn't want to know. I just thought I'd..."
Graham.
Extreme example. I'll admit, extreme example.
Oh.
Very extreme.
Oh, I know people who are in exactly the same position and they do that. I'd rather not know. Oh, well, you'd rather spend the rest of your life in a box, for goodness sake.
Yeah. So, there was a guy who in every other part of his life, business-wise, he'd been very successful, but had just he just reduced himself to a sort of a blubbering mess, literally, because he hadn't been prepared to start that process of 3 simple questions. What's the worst that can happen? Well, I got cancer. How can I improve, or how can I prepare for that? And there's a whole range of ways with all the knowledge we've got and people who've been through it and so on. How can I improve on the worst? Well, I can, talk to people who've beaten cancer. I can talk to people who've been through a similar experience. How have they managed, and so on. So there's, these are, but you've got to have intentionality to be able to go down that pathway.
Graham, a lot of people won't know one of the more intricate details of your trip to Sydney. You were called from a very successful, very strong, large church here in Adelaide to go to a church in Sydney which had gone through a bit of a trial with 1 or 2 issues and was also facing a big building program. And that would be enough to drive anybody spare. A big developer offering to buy your property and build a multi-story over it and let you have 2 floors for a church. You must have gone through hell and high water.
Well, it was something I wasn't prepared for in theological college, Colin, I can tell you that. Fortunately, some of my business background did kick in, but I was surrounded in that church, which was on the lower North Shore of Sydney, very blessed to be surrounded by extremely capable people. And so we formed a task group, and that task group worked for about 2 to 3 years to pull that project off. And today it stands there in Crow's Nest. That church occupies 3 levels of a 7-story residential tower. And it's one of the most exciting building projects that our denomination has ever undertaken. But the stress levels during that project, Cole, were off the chart. That was a period where for a number of months I slept with a notepad next to my bed, because I wanted to avoid a situation where I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and I'm sure many people can identify with this. You wake up in a sweat because the problem that you thought you could leave when you drifted off to sleep, all of a sudden this comes back to you in the middle of the night. So the reason for the pad was to answer 4 questions. What is the problem? What is this thing that I've suddenly woken up about that's causing me to not sleep? What is the problem? What are the causes of the problem? That's number 2. Number 3, what are the possible solutions? Let your mind just go wild, write down anything that's sort of, even no matter how crazy. And then what is the best possible solution? Now, for me, in the absence of any other formula, trying to answer those 4 questions was a lot better than just lying there helplessly tossing and turning and coming up with no answers. And that was one application of those 4 questions. One of the best applications was one of our Dale Carnegie graduates many years ago in Melbourne. He was in a job where his whole life was made up of people knocking on his door and saying, "Hey, Dave, we've got a problem." Now, it was in a manufacturing industry. And I mean, you imagine that's his whole life was, "Hey, Dave, we've got a problem." In brackets, "Dave, my problem, I want to become your problem." So he produced a little card with these 4 questions printed on the card. What is the problem? What are the causes of the problem? What are the possible solutions? What is the best possible solution? His life changed dramatically because people would come to the door, "Hey, Dave, we've got a problem." And he would reach one of these cards. He'd say, "Stop, don't say a word. Take this card, go back to your team, and you come back when you've got answers." His story to the class was, all of a sudden, the number of people knocking on my door has gone down by about 2/3. They were solving their own problem. And look, to this day, it's one of the best examples I've heard of a simple technique, very simple. I mean, anybody could have thought of it, as it happens, Dale Carnegie did back in the 30s. But that transformed the effectiveness and the efficiency of that whole plant.
Look, if you're listening to this as a podcast, but you haven't gone to the YouTube channel to see the podcast there in video format, you will also see a little download where I have produced a card. And if you can copy that and print it off, stick it back to back to make it stiff and hard, you can go and give it to everybody in your organisation. I reckon that's a great little story, Graham, and I think that'll sweep the nation as people get hold of that simple idea. Good for you, Graham. The thought occurs to me that many people don't do something like that. They stay asleep, or they stay semi-asleep, toss, turn. Oh, should I have gone to the toilet? I should have gone to the toilet half an hour ago. Oh, they're still thinking, oh, what shall I do? And then they wake up their partner and have a bit of a whinge to them, and it just isn't going to work, is it?
No, well, as I say, Colin, in the absence of any other formula, and they got me through a lot of tough spots during that project in Sydney, and in other ways, other challenges I've faced over the years.
Good on you. I asked you at the beginning how you control stress in your life. You can see a clue how I control stress in mine. It's right behind me. That is a rose that I struck from a cutting. It's Mr. Lincoln. I own the Mr. Lincoln rose bush, and I took some cuttings and made myself a Mr. Lincoln. And right alongside there in the little pot where they're growing is another one that I got from Christine's sister. And we didn't know the name of it, but it comes out as a beautiful, rich blood red. So we call it Auntie Leslie. And those two are my pride and joy. But I have about 25 rose bushes, and that's how I control stress, except in the winter, waiting for those first leaves. But I've got to say, can't do anything about that. Rain and sunshine, they'll all come along. But that's why I put the rose behind us, because it's such a beautiful, peaceful thing.
Very attractive, Col. Very attractive.
Now, I asked you earlier at the beginning how you control stress in your life. One of them is going for long drives, wishing you were in a Pontiac Bonneville from 1968.
Wow, you remember the model. I think I've only ever shared that with you once. That is my favourite American classic car, a 1964 Pontiac Bonneville, or anything from the 60s, actually, with the Bonnevilles. Yeah, look, I like
had
to go
one.
driving.
Is when we lived in America, we had a Pontiac Bonneville, a cream one with velour seats. It was beautiful.
Yes.
Road along the ground. Very, very good to steer through the snowdrift. That was great fun. You prefer the 64?
The only reason I say 64, Colin, is because in that year, my best friend at high school, I was in high school in Sydney, and his father imported one from America. And so I felt very proud to be best friends with the guy whose dad had a 64 Bonneville, because that was a pretty big deal in those days.
Okay, but long drives and interesting places. Is that your story for reducing your own stress?
Yes, I love to get away. I've developed the ability, I think, Cole, of being able to switch off from the stresses of my role, which is ministry. I've developed over the years what I call the smelly camel syndrome. In the course of any given day, I will talk to a lot of people about their issues, their problems. When they've got me 100%. They'll bring in their smelly camels, and I'll pat the smelly camel, and we'll talk about the smelly camel. But the idea is at the end of that meeting, they take the smelly camel, so that I haven't got an office of smelly camels at the end of the day.
Now, wait a minute. I'm not trying to be a smart aleck, but follow the metaphor through. Smelly camels do leave an odour. How long does the odour stay with you in terms of stress? Because some of them are very awful.
Well, I guess that comes under the heading of, being a caring person. Naturally, I get affected. All people anybody in the people business, if you're hearing about issues and concerns, naturally you get affected by people's sadness and sorrows. But you've got to be very careful for your own effectiveness, not to carry all of that with you, because your bag is going to fill up very, very quickly. And so just to be able to detach yourself and rejuvenate and refresh your own spirit and your own mind is very important. So for me, walks on the beach are a very important part of my stress reliever, and drives in the country. And I get certain projects. I love photography, and I get into certain projects on my computer, and so yeah, I think everybody has to have a way of relieving the inevitable stresses that come.
I just thought of something that we could say to people who are a bit difficult and constantly on edge and carrying their stress around with them. We could just go, can you smell camels? Because that person is still carrying the camels of what happened last night, what happened at home, what happened with a customer, what happened 2 hours before in a staff meeting. And you've got to send the camels away.
Exactly.
Gee, they stink. I rode one up Mount Sinai for 2 hours. I don't think I could have imagined anything worse to have to endure, apart from the smell he rocked and bumped. And there you go. Graham, how do you reckon your ability to manage your own stress has increased your effectiveness as a leader? A lot of people think that ministers sit around in their pajamas till 4 o'clock in the afternoon and have a cucumber sandwich and then read a book and go to bed. It ain't nothing like that. There's people, there's pressure, there's volunteers who quit, there's volunteers who want to start who aren't competent. Oh my goodness. How has it made you more effective to learn to manage your stress?
Well, I think, Colin, in the area of vision, if the feedback is correct, one of the things that people have said about my particular style of ministry is that I have the ability to paint a vision of a preferred future, and I've helped churches to move toward that vision. So you've got to be less inclined to be a panic merchant and a stressed out person, to be able to formulate visions and to be able to sort of assess what a church is capable of. So I've tried to major in that area. The other thing I've tried to do, Colin, is create an atmosphere in which people can excel in their own particular gift areas. Any success I've had in ministry has been because I've had a whole bunch of people around me who've absolutely gone for it in terms of using their abilities and their gifts to make an impact on the community and to make our faith community as effective as it can be. During that project in Sydney, I would walk into that planning meeting where, in my estimation, they were 8s and 9s and 10s, and I would walk in, and even on a good day, at about a 6.75 compared to their giftedness. But I knew my role. My role was to keep them all vision focused, to keep painting the vision in crystal clear images, and just to, with my own persona, to be able to create an environment where they thought, we can do this. So they're perhaps two of the main ways in which I've been able to increase my effectiveness as a leader, by deliberately choosing ways of reducing stress.
Good on you. You've given us huge value. Thank you so much. You've been brilliant.
Pleasure, Colin.
And I look forward to my next stress-relieving coffee with the great GA. And I wish a whole lot of other people could join us, but that'd be too stressful, Graham.
It would be. Good on you, Cole. Really good to be part of it.
Ta-da.
You've been listening to Be So Good with Colin Pierce. Please share the link with someone who needs to be reminded that they are 10 times better than they think. For more episodes, check out the playlist at colinpierce.com/podcast. And don't forget to drop a review in iTunes. It really does make a difference.